let's bring in Middle East geopolitics expert Trita Parsi for more on what this all means. Let's start with the strike in Damascus. Trita, how big of an escalation was this? And if you can explain for our international audience, what are the larger regional implications of it?
This is without a doubt a very significant escalation because it was targeting a building that is part of the Iranian diplomatic compound, which means that technically it is Iranian territory. Not only is that a violation, of course, of Iran's red line in which it is treating any attack on its own soil as a casus belli, but also because it is in clear violation of some of the most fundamental norms of the laws of warfare, which is that even under the worst of circumstances, you do not attack the diplomatic compounds and territory of another country, embassies, etc. Israel now has done so, and it will more or less force Iran to respond one way or another, particularly if there isn't a very clear condemnation from the international community. And that can then spark a larger military confrontation.
Right. I mean, most people think of embassies, consulates as a safe space, one that is not touched. And this really hasn't ever happened.
And that is usually the case.
You're right.
Yeah, that is exactly usually the case. And the few instances in which it has happened, it's been declared to be mistakes, such as when the U.S. struck the Chinese embassy in Serbia. But for a state to deliberately do this, take credit for it, as they have done to the New York Times, that is unprecedented. But then again, if you take a look at what has happened in the last 6 months or so, there has been a systematic effort by the Israelis to violate almost every law of war that exists, from targeting aid convoys, assassinating doctors inside of hospitals, bombing hospitals, forcing a famine, torturing UN staff. A lot of these things may not be completely unprecedented, but they're unprecedented in the sense that they have not occurred at least for another 50 or 60 years.
As we heard, Iran's President Reyes said that the strike would, quote, not go unpunished, end quote. What are we likely to see from Iran?
The Iranians may strike back at Israeli interest in other countries or ships, etc. They may try to do something inside of Israel itself. But there's also a risk that they will stop restraining Iraqi and Syrian militias who have been targeting the U.S. There has been a 6-week pause in the attacks by these militias against U.S. forces, which is mainly because the U.S. has been striking them very hard, but also because of the pressure that Iran has put on those militias. The Iranians may stop holding them back at this point because the Iranians are holding the U.S. responsible for the Israeli action because the U.S. is arming and funding Israel, just as much as the United States is holding Iran responsible for what the Houthis do because of the support that the Iranians are providing to the Houthis.
So what does this incident impact some of the diplomatic efforts that we've been seeing behind the scenes to bring the tensions and the temperature down in the region? What does this strike in Syria do to that effort?
So, for instance, we have secret talks that have been taking place between the Iranians and the U.S. that has tried to lower the tension, but also find ways for a ceasefire in Gaza. There's obviously also the effort by Qatar and Egypt for a ceasefire. I think the talks between the U.S. and Iran may very well end up being severely damaged by this strike by the Israelis, particularly since the Iranians will apply the same logic on the U.S. as the U.S. applies on Iran, which is ultimately it doesn't matter if Iran was involved or green-lighted any attacks by the Houthis, the U.S. holds Iran responsible. The Iranians are applying the same logic to the U.S. And if that deconfliction channel ends up no longer being active, then that is another dangerous development that can lead to a situation in which we will see a regional war, one that the U.S. has dragged into.
Trita Parsi, always great to get your take. Thank you so much for joining us from here in Washington.